Always a pleasure to come to Tuesday group, whether you get to be at the front of the room or at the back. Always so many wonderful things to learn here. We're excited to be here today. So this was our wedding day a long time ago. The end of March 2010, it ended up being the last day that we could go dog sledding. And so we got married on White Iron Lake. And a month later, we would take off on what we deemed our honeymoon. One thing that you can't see in this picture, but my 7-year-old nephew actually climbed in the front of the sled, so we had a passenger as we dog sledded away from our wedding. And this is Chris Mayer. Some of you may know Chris. He works for the Forest Service now. Oh, that's good. So a month after we got married, we set off on our honeymoon. We started here in Bellingham, Washington, and we would paddle up the inside passage and then work our way back through the boundary waters and eventually down to Key West, Florida. We were traveling for 27 of 36 months. And really the purpose of this journey was to share it with students. We had about 85,000 students from schools across the country that would tune in every day, Monday through Friday, to sort of learn about what we were doing, the animals we were encountering, the people we were meeting, and they would vote and use polls to decide where we go and what we do. So you can see we had some sort of unusual things in our canoes and kayaks and dog sleds. We had computers, a satellite terminal, battery packs, solar panels, so that we could communicate with the students as we travel and teach them about these wild places and get them excited about heading out and exploring on their own. Yeah.
Your honeymoon, how come 2 tents?
Oh. Yeah, well, so not only did we have a third wheel in the dog sled as we left our wedding site, but we actually had 2 bachelors in their 50s that joined us for the first 2 months of the journey up the inside passage. And so I think that's our friend John's tent. Very observant. Yeah, so the first few months of the journey were spent paddling up the inside passage. It's a beautiful place. The mountains just drop straight down into the ocean, and it's full of lots of wildlife. We set up our tent in about 600 places over the course of the journey. And some of the most dramatic ones actually were along this stretch the first few months. But lots of animals, sea lions and seals. And we were really surprised by the life in the intertidal zone. So when the water would drop, it would expose sea stars, and these are sea anemones drooping down from the rocks. And lots of life, far more life in the ocean than we had expected. And there were also larger animals, like these whales. We were about a mile from shore, and we were paddling through Southeast Alaska, and these 2 huge humpback whales started swimming right towards us. And I looked at Amy and said, "Do you think they see us?" And they ended up stopping right next to us, about 15, 20 feet away. And our friend John, one of the bachelors, he was at a different angle, and he could see this giant eyeball the size of a dinner plate sort of staring up at us. So sort of came to check us out, and then just, sunk below the surface.
So as Lacey pointed out, we wrote a book about this journey, right? So my job today is to read some passages from the book. And I just want to point out that it's our story. We're talking about the adventure, what we experienced along the way. And unfortunately, some of those things were threats to the environment. And so we bring those up in the book. That's what I'm going to start with here. The bows of our kayaks connected with the soft sand, but what had appeared to be a pristine beach deep in the Canadian coastal wilderness from a distance soon transformed into an eerie scene. This remote cove was filled with colorful man-made detritus. How could this be? We were miles from the nearest road or town. Sifting our fingers through the sand revealed a mixture of pulverized plastic and styrofoam, over which were strewn lighters, tangled fishing nets, weathered Croc shoes, tampon applicators, soda bottles, and thousands of other pieces of plastic garbage slowly being degraded by the sun, wind, sand, and water. It took us 5 minutes to clear a garbage-free spot large enough for a 2-person tent. John set up his tent on a huge 8-inch thick flat piece of styrofoam rather than trying to clear a mound of trash. Somehow the water flushing through the Cordero Channel was depositing tons of plastic on this beach, as billions of gallons of water ebbed and flowed with the same steady rhythm that had governed the tides for millennia. How long had this beach been like this? Where did all this garbage come from? Why here? Where the plastic came from was most likely as varied as the waste itself. Some of it likely reached the ocean from the closest communities or boaters passing through. But some could have traveled thousands of miles in the vast Pacific Ocean's winds and currents from as far away as Asia. All we could grasp at the time was that the tides and currents, wind, waves, and storms had turned this quarter-mile long beach into a repository. But not to leave you too depressed, there were some beautiful scenes we encountered too, and this is one of those. And so at this spot, we had struggled to find a place to camp. We were paddling along a really cliffy section, the Fraser Reach, and we finally spotted a place where the cliff kind of formed a ledge right next to a waterfall that like we could get out of our kayaks, but we had to time our exit of this spot very carefully. We'd have to exit, like launch our kayaks again exactly 12 hours later because of the changing height of the tides. So we were camped right next to a gorgeous waterfall. At some time in the night, John slipped out of his tent to pee. The rain had stopped and the sky was clear. The stars were a welcome sight. He peered over the edge, expecting to see reflections of the stars in the calm water, but was instead witness to a much brighter ethereal glow. Below our, I lost it. We just, thanks, Lacey. Okay. Where was it? Ethereal glow. Below our camp lay what looked like a portal into another dimension. Where the rushing water entered the ocean, it excited a plume of bioluminescent plankton. Get up, he called. You have to see this. Millions of miniature creatures in the water emitted a glow when agitated by the falling water. Looking down into that pulsing, glowing plume was like viewing the Milky Way from above. In that moment, we no longer had sore muscles or frustrations. Watching an ocean of life churning and swirling in the glowing depths left us completely in awe, as if glimpsing into a hidden world that had lain in wait just under us this whole time. When had the last human perched here on a moonless night to witness this phenomenon? How can we place a value on this natural wonder or calculate the cost of an oil spill that destroys the tiny plankton pulsing and glowing in the depths? They brought joy and wonder to our hearts, but more importantly, they were the building blocks on which life here relied, feeding minnows, humpbacks, and everything in between. They formed the foundation from which all life above and below these waters flourished. We stared silently at nature's phosphorescent fireworks until the cold seeping through our lawn underwear coaxed us back to bed.
So we started this journey on Earth Day of 2010, and by the 4th of July, we had reached Skagway, Alaska, in the northern part of Southeast Alaska. And from here, we would hike over the Chilkoot Pass, which was one of the main ways that the Stampeders were trying to reach the Klondike gold fields. And we would paddle down the Yukon River, and then we would have to cross a mountain range called the Tombstone Mountains. And it would take us about 2 weeks to cross these mountains. And we'd been through some pretty wild places, but this was the first really wild place where for 2 weeks there were basically no trails. We didn't see any footprints. You could stand on top of these mountains and look in any direction, and there were no lights, there were no buildings, there were no signs of humans anywhere. It was really a special place. It was hard. We're about to set up camp, and the night before we had camped like right over here. It was if you could draw a straight line across, it was about 4 miles, and I think it'd take us like 10 hours. It was pretty brutal, but it just made us feel alive to be in this place that felt so untrammeled. And so after the 2 weeks hiking through the Tombstone Mountains, we had arranged for an outfitter in Dawson to bring our canoe and 3 weeks worth of supplies to where this little stream called the Blackstone River flowed underneath the Dempster Highway, which is this 300-mile long little gravel road that goes up to the Arctic Ocean. And so we put our canoe into the Blackstone and started heading down river. And we had expected the water to be very low, possibly making it hard for us to paddle sort of midsummer like it was. But there actually had been a huge rainstorm, and so the river was in flood. And so the first full day on the river, we paddled about 80 miles, which was more than we had traveled in the 2 weeks prior, hauling everything on our backs. And it reminded us of canoeing so much. But this is a really special place. This is part of Beringia. So you can see how this all looks like giant gravel here. Basically, this area was never scoured, was never covered in glaciers during the last ice age. So you can find like mammoth tusks and bones jutting out of the mountainsides. It's a very unusual landscape. And this would take us down to the Peel River, and we would follow the Peel River to the Mackenzie River, where it empties into the Arctic Ocean. And this is in the canyon along the Peel River. We had to do like a several-mile portage around these huge waterfalls. And this is the gravel beach at the bottom of the last falls where we could finally put our canoe in the water and start paddling again. And by the time we reached the Mackenzie River, it was getting cold. We were losing about 7 minutes of daylight a day. We'd been traveling pretty much continually since April. It's now the end of September. And it was close to time for us to take a break. So we ended this part of the journey by traveling 500 miles upstream against the Mackenzie River. And while we were doing this part of the journey, we were reading Alexander Mackenzie's journal. And Alexander Mackenzie is sort of like the Canadian equivalent of Lewis and Clark. And in his journal, he explained that they would paddle about a third of the time. They would line their canoe, which is what we're doing here, basically just walking along, pulling the canoe with a rope. And then when there was a strong tailwind, they would put up a sail and paddle and sail at the same time. That was the fastest way to travel, when you had a tailwind and could capture the wind and paddle. And when we look back on this 500 miles, it was basically the same. We paddled a third of the time. We were able to sort of sail and paddle a third of the time, and we just walked along shore lining about a third of the time.
Why there?
Why what?
Because fine, easy to walk, easy to walk.
Well, I mean, it's sort of hard to. So the question was why here, and the question, it's because of the speed of the current. you can't really tell here, but we were lining because it was fairly easy to walk, right? And because the current was a little stronger in this place, once our speed dropped to about, I don't know, 1.5 miles an hour or something, it was like we needed to change something up. And so we would get out and start walking and hauling the canoe. Yeah. And so after that 500 miles of upstream travel, we reached a town called Norman Wells. And this is where we would stop, take a break, come back to Minnesota, visit schools to do presentations, and prepare to head back north with our sled dogs.
And just to give you a little taste of the dog sledding. After a thicket of willows, we entered a narrow tunnel of snow-plastered, stunted black spruce trees, reminiscent of Dr. Zhivago. The snow had coated the spruce branches in bread loaf-sized lobes, weighted the branches so much that they angled down severely, like a forest of closing umbrellas. How could their branches support such an absurd load of snow? The scraggly trees were not much taller than the tops of our heads, but they were probably quite old, belying the harsh climate in which they grew. Most days were clear and oppressively cold, despite the dazzling sun glinting off each of the billions and billions of snow crystals that coated the spruces and piled in waist-deep, undulating waves on top of the frozen fog. We squinted in the glare to keep an eye on the dogs as they happily trotted along. The heat of their bodies and vapor from their breaths rose around us like a jet contrail. The snow-covered spruce branches surrounding us muffled sound. All we could hear was close and self-created, the rhythmic panting of the dogs, the faint jingling of the tags on their collars, the continuous swish of sled runners across the snow. We each became more aware of the rhythmic pulse of our own heartbeat and breath, which increased in cadence and volume when running behind the sled to warm up.
So our winter route would take us up the Mackenzie River, across Great Bear Lake, and then through a wild section down and across Great Slave Lake. And we had 2 other folks join us for this part of the journey, Ellen and Van. They live in Babbitt. Some of you may know them as well. And so Ellen worked with us at Wintergreen Dogsled Lodge for many years, and Van worked at Outward Bound for a few years, dog sledding there. So the 4 of us gathered up 2 6-dog teams. And you know, the dogs, especially for the kids, the dogs were always the star of the show. And this one here, Fennel, is a special dog. He actually was Bert and Johnny's dog from their kennel, and we were lucky enough to take him on many adventures. And one of the highlights of this part of the journey, and really the journey as a whole, was that this winter dog sledding, we traveled through 7 remote communities that are only accessible by ice road for a couple months in the winter. And so in these communities, we met a lot of Dene people who are still living very close to the land. And we were really just welcomed into these communities and learned so much from them. And I always like to point out that even at 40 below, Amy has a good smile. This was crossing one of our favorite lakes called Hada Lake.
So just to give you a taste of like our reception into one of these communities. So this is our arrival in Delaney on Great Bear Lake. And it's worth pointing out that there aren't a lot of sled dogs in most of these communities nowadays. So we were something of a novelty. A short, steep hill flung us onto Great Bear Lake's vast frozen expanse. The dogs picked up speed and trotted happily down the wide ice road, plowed across the 8th largest lake in the world. Ahead of us, a plow truck was battling the wind's constant attempt to cover the road in drifting snow. The faint outline of rooftops and buildings dotted the shoreline 5 miles across the bay. With the temperature hovering around negative 43 degrees Fahrenheit during the warmest part of the day, we were looking forward to resting in Delaney for a couple days and awaiting slightly warmer temperatures before continuing our journey. A truck heading toward town rolled slowly past us, and we waved at its smiling occupants who were pointing and staring at us from the cab's bubble of warmth. Soon vehicles were traveling out from town in a steady trickle to wave and take photos as we approached. A red truck slowed to our pace, and several members from the tribal council welcomed us to town. They explained that everyone there had two-way radios in their houses and vehicles, so the first truck that passed us had announced our arrival, and everyone in Delaney knew we were coming. When we asked them if there were any good places to camp on the edge of town, they didn't provide much of an answer before driving away. Minutes later, another truck passed us taking photos. The truck turned around, slowed to a crawl, and a cheery couple rolled down their window. They asked where we were planning to stay, and we said we didn't know. We don't know. Do you have any recommendations for where we could camp near town? They glanced at each other and said, how about you stay at our house? We're leaving town in about an hour to drive to Fort Good Hope for a volleyball tournament, and we'll be gone all weekend. You'll have the house to yourselves, then you can stake your dogs out in our yard. We asked how to find their house. The woman with a twinkle in her eye behind dark-rimmed glasses said, I'm Berna, this is Bruce. Everyone knows where we live. You could ask anyone in town, but we'll show you the way. Soon they were leading our dog teams through the streets of Delaney with their flashers on. A myriad of smells, a smattering of barking dogs, and trucks filled with curious residents out for a drive in search of the dog teams made for an exciting trip down icy roads with 12 amped up sled dogs. Before long, we had the dogs staked out, and Bruce and Verna were instructing us to help ourselves to anything in the fridge. Bruce also pointed out a pile of frozen lake trout in the shed out back that we could chop up and feed the dogs. Once inside, we realized that we had met Bruce a few months earlier when we were paddling up the Mackenzie. He had been out hunting moose and had stopped to chat with us briefly as we slowly paddled upstream. A few minutes later, we were alone in a warm house, sitting in stunned silence, a little unsure of what just happened. Well, that was awesome. I'm gonna make some tea. Does anyone else want some? Who's gonna take the first shower? Ellen beamed. And we just want to share another story about a very influential person we met, also in Delaney. Oh, and just a couple of vocabulary words for you guys. So ENR up in the Northwest Territories, that stands for Environment and Natural Resources, kind of like our DNR here. And skidoo, I bet you guys, well, you know skidoo, right? Skidoo equals snowmobile. See, I've had to say this when we're presenting like in New York and stuff. Anyways, we stopped by the white metal-sided ENR building to pick up our resupply. A uniformed man with buzz-cut, jet black hair greeted us at the door with a smile. Leroy had been expecting us. He invited us into his office to talk about our upcoming route across Great Bear Lake. In his khaki shirt with the polar bear logo on the sleeve and brown work pants, he was short but strong and slightly older than us. Leroy's smile, accentuated by a short-trimmed goatee, never faded. The only prompt Leroy needed was Van placing our maps on his desk. I grew up here, hunting and trapping by dog team in the winter and motorboat in the summer, he began. We tried to envision Leroy out in a small boat on the vast expanse of Great Bear Lake during the brief summer when it's ice-free. He talked about streams we would pass and small crystal clear lakes filled with whitefish that hardly anyone visits anymore. He explained, "You'll be dog sledding through the heart of the caribou's wintering area, so I'm pretty sure there will be skidoo tracks from local hunters." Having covered the necessary logistics about our route, the conversation shifted. Sled dogs have all been replaced by snow machines, but caribou remain an important source of food for the Dene. Leroy explained that the caribou numbers have been steadily declining, leaving scientists and locals alarmed. Things were changing so fast, and the loss of the caribou seemed like another slash at the Dene's cultural fabric. Looking up from the map, Leroy said, "When you travel by dog team, you see every rock, every tree. The land speaks to you. You can hear the land." His eyes took on a glossier sheen as he continued. "Now the young people always have their headphones on and they're staring at screens, TVs, and playing video games. When they go outside, they race around in skidoos or in trucks. They can't hear the land, and so they feel lost. They have lost their purpose. I've been a hunter all my life, being out on the land, bringing back food. That's my purpose. That's what I know. When I was a kid, if we had a couple fish hooks and a little string, I felt rich. We would spend all day out fishing and were proud to bring home food." He took a sip of tea before saying, "Things have changed so much."
Yeah, I think in many ways, Leroy helped us realize that sort of hearing the land is really why we love spending time out in nature on these long journeys, because I think we feel lost too when we're in buildings and looking at screens all the time. So once we reached the south end of Great Slave Lake, the ice was starting to melt. All the snow was basically gone. So we loaded all the dogs and all of us into a truck and trailer and traveled back to Ely and distributed the dogs to their owners and said goodbye to Ellen and Van, did a bunch of school presentations, and then headed back north again. And on this time, we would be paddling all summer back to Lake Superior. And when we started paddling on Great Slave Lake, it's a very short summer up there, and it's a big lake, so it doesn't thaw until very late in the summer. So it was still about 90% covered in ice. And so we just sort of used our canoe like an icebreaker to push our way through the pans of ice for about 50 miles until we could paddle up. We would leave the lake and paddle south upstream against the Tulsen River. And the students all along, they were making decisions for us. And one of the decisions they made was, what should we do with Fennel? And so Fennel was nearing retirement. I think he was 11 at the time. And they said he should spend his retirement canoeing across Canada with you. And we thought, well, that seems like a good idea. But we're not sure that Fennel had ever been in a canoe before. So we took him down to the harbor in Grand Marais on Lake Superior, and we put him in a canoe and we paddled around the harbor. He seemed to do okay, so we figured he was good to go. And he turned out to be a very good canoe dog. Another thing was it took us 7 weeks to paddle to the next town. And so we didn't have enough food. We couldn't fit all of our food and all of our equipment and a 100-pound sled dog and 7 weeks worth of dog food in the canoe. So Fennel ended up actually just eating fish the whole time. So when he saw the fishing rod, he was really excited. This was a very wild part of our journey. Many of the places between Great Slave Lake and Lake Athabasca, another large lake where we spent about a month traveling, there were very few, if any, trails to follow. Very wild country, very barren country. And slowly over the course of the summer, we continued south, crossing other large lakes like this one, Walston Lake in northern Manitoba, and eventually working our way into more populated areas and right through the boundary waters, right along the border. We actually came down and stopped in Ely for a few days to visit friends, and then eventually went down the Grand Portage to Lake Superior. And because the Edmunds Fitzgerald sank in November and we reached the Grand Portage around Halloween, we thought it was best to take the winter off and start back up in the spring. So we would spend the final year of our journey paddling from Lake Superior along sort of the traditional Voyageur route out the St. Lawrence Seaway, and then eventually down to Key West. And so we started in Lake Superior, where we still could just fill our water bottles and our pots right from the lake, this clean, clear water resource. And then slowly as we traveled, we were going through more and more populated areas. We paddled right through the heart of New York City, right past the Statue of Liberty. And the reason that we did this, really, the whole vision when we set out, was that the final year we wouldn't be traveling through all these wild places, but we would be stopping in communities along the way so that we could share our story. So we did lots of school presentations and presentations for adults along the East Coast to try and help them understand these vast wildernesses and maybe get to listen to the land a little bit. And when we were just south of New York City, we stopped in a little town called Barnegat Bay to do a presentation for a group of adults. And they said, there's this big storm coming, so maybe you should stay here. And that storm ended up being Superstorm Sandy. And so they were evacuated, so they sent us off to their friend's house. It was a whole ordeal. But when everything was still flooded, we got our kayaks out and would paddle to their kayak business, which is right on the coast, to see what it looked like. And this is what it looked like. And so we ended up spending about a week with them, trying to help just start sort of the process of rebuilding. But this, being in the middle of this storm, really sort of, it was an eye-opener.
I'll share a bit about what it was like paddling after that. Wreckage of all shapes and sizes littered the water. Salt marshes and shore, 30-foot motorboats skewered on pilings, sailboats tipped over in boatyards, piles of rubble where houses once stood, and plastic garbage scattered by the wind. Paddling through Sandy's wake at 3 miles an hour left us plenty of time to contemplate what we saw. For at least 100 miles, the damage and debris were humbling. What would happen to all this junk? From plastic bags and pop bottles littering the marshes, to waterlogged couches and smashed vehicles, mountains of construction rubble, and hundreds of destroyed, half-sunken boats of all sizes and stripes. Much of it would eventually be hauled to a landfill, but clearly unknown amounts of fuel and other toxins would continue to leach into the water as the sun, wind, and waves slowly broke the garbage into smaller bits to be scattered through the food chain. We had thought that the ocean's plastics were the result of careless humans tossing their garbage overboard or into nearby streams, which eventually carried the garbage into the world's oceans. But now we were experiencing plastic pollution that dwarfed anything we had seen before, even that plastic-covered beach where we camped in British Columbia near the beginning of our journey. This wasn't caused by careless acts of individuals. It was the product of the modern world colliding with climate change, intensified natural disaster. On the outskirts of Atlantic City, New Jersey, we slid past marsh grasses glistening in an unnatural oily sheen, dotted with plastic shopping bags fluttering in a headwind that was slowing our progress. In the coming months and years, much of this would be cleaned up and the human footprint on the coast rebuilt and strengthened, probably with even larger houses and more opulence. But how long can this last? Climate change is already causing sea levels to rise and hurricanes to become more severe. The media headlines were focused on the human toll of Sandy and the billions of dollars required to rebuild. But surveying the damage from our kayaks left us to wonder what impact all this debris flushed into the oceans by the storm would have, and how larger, perhaps more frequent storms combined with sea level rise would fundamentally transform this coastline. Before Sandy, sea level rise and climate change's amplifications of severe weather remained distant and abstract to us, but now they were all we could think about.
A few months later, we paddled into Key West, Florida. It was a pretty underwhelming experience, really. You know, we pulled up and someone tried to shoo us away because they're like, kayaks aren't allowed here. You know, it's like, and in many ways, it seemed just like any other lunch stop on this journey where we would paddle and stop and set up camp over and over in wild places and urban centers. But this was the last stop, and this 3-year journey really changed us, I think, as any journey does, right? And it really helped solidify for us that using spending time out in the natural world and appreciating these wild places like the Boundary Waters are really important, but that also as the people that are out there experiencing these places, we can't just appreciate them. We also have to speak loudly for them and work to protect them, because people have been doing that for generations before us, and now it's our turn. And this is, in some ways, this is what gave us both the skills and the confidence and sort of the drive to spend a year in the Boundary Waters. This was a very transformative experience that helped us understand both how amazing our world is, but also how fragile it is as well. So we hope you've enjoyed our presentation. We've got a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer a few questions.
We're down to one microphone, so questions, y'all can holler, and if you could just repeat the question.
Yeah.
Right. What's next?
Yeah. What's next? Well, so we have been sort of splitting our time between Ely and living on a sailboat. And so we've been spending our winters sailing and doing live video streams into classrooms to teach them about wild places. And a lot of the education we're doing now is about oceans and why oceans are important, because we're floating on the ocean, and we're beaming into classes and interacting with the kids to teach them about oceans. So we're doing that for half the year, and then the other half of the year we're here in Ely.
The question is, what method did we use to keep from getting lost? Well, we were traveling with like a small GPS device, so that would always kind of tell us where we were, but we did use paper maps for a fair bit of it. Am I missing anything?
No.
That's it. Yep. And a compass,
yeah.
Of course, with the maps. Yeah. No, I don't think we're unique. There are a lot of people that are doing lots of long journeys, and some of them have educational components to them, some don't. But yeah, there are other people doing similar things, definitely.
How did you work that?
So the question was, how did we anticipate weather events and plan around them? So it was a mixture. oftentimes, especially when we were kayaking, we had our little trusty little like weather radio we'd listen to and hear the forecast. So it was a ritual to drink our coffee and listen to the forecast every morning. And we basically decided if there was a small craft advisory, kayaks are pretty small craft, so we wouldn't go then. But also, since we had the satellite terminal to share our information with the classrooms, we would use that sometimes to like get a more detailed weather forecast and make a decision about whether we would go or not on some days.
Curious, great picture of you with the frost around your hood. 40 below, how did you protect your face and lungs?
Yeah, so at 40 below, how did we protect our face and lungs? So I mean, part of that was like the fur ruff. It's not just fashion. Like having that, it was Wolverine fur around our faces really helped. And then also, like a neck gaiter, balaclava sort of thing, either made out of like wool or a synthetic kind of polar fleecy material.
What is your writing process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was sort of about the writing process, like how did we write the book? Did we write it sort of during the journey or afterwards? So it was really a mixture. So during the journey, Amy actually was keeping like a handwritten journal. So she was writing in a journal, sort of more personal experiences. And then we also were doing a lot of writing for the students, like we would write sort of weekly blog posts and different things like that for them. And then basically, we started writing this book in 2018. So it was like 5 years after we had finished the journey. And so we basically just went through everything that we had written. And then we just tried to sort of pick out what we felt like were the most important things to say. And then very little of the actual word, very few of the sentences or paragraphs that we had written before actually ended up in the book. I mean, like everything was all rewritten 5 times. And so like our first book, this book is in the we voice. So it's just singular voice for both of us. And so we could open the book up and read a paragraph, and I don't think we would have any idea whether I wrote it or Amy wrote it. It's all just jumbled up. Yeah. Okay. How did we afford to do this? Well, I think the main thing was just and we still are this way, just living very simply. I mean, we had a 20 by 16 wall tent on a little piece of woods with no electricity, no water, nothing, right? That was like our base. So we had very little sort of overhead. And then the funding for it came from, we did this through the Wilderness Classroom, which is a nonprofit organization. And so schools were paying us to come in and do like live presentations, and then private donations and corporate sponsors like Current Designs donated our kayaks, and Winona donated our canoes, and Cliff Bar donated Cliff Bars, and things like that. Yeah, and like Wintergreen Northern Wear was one of our sponsors. Seeger Mucklucks, I think, donated mucklucks. Crapola donated granola. So it came from a wide range of sources, but we were on like a real slim budget. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, she's got one. I don't know what it is.
The question is, what was our most dire moments on the trip, and kind of how did we handle it? Well, I mean, there were a couple, and one that comes to mind is while we were dog sledding with Ellen and Van, we were, it was on Great Bear Lake shortly before we would actually leave Great Bear Lake. And after we had left Delaney, we knew like weather was sort of coming up, and we experienced the beginning of this blizzard as we were doing sort of a portage across a peninsula. We popped out onto the lake again, and we had to decide, like, are we going to cross this bay as we're, you know, beginning to get like whiteout conditions, or we could set up camp right here, or we could kind of like work our way around the bay, kind of hugging shore. And we ultimately decided to go for it, heading like 20 miles across this bay, partially because it was giving us a tailwind, and the temperature was quite mild. We knew the temperature was going to drop, but we had a little bit of time where we could just kind of like go for it. But traveling in our little train, like on ski, so 2 of us on skis, 2 of us on the dog sleds, we had to keep each other like very, very close. You know, if one person lost sight of the group, I don't know how they would have like found their way, you know, back to the main group again. So it really kind of tested our skills and friendship and communication. And Ellen was out in front with the compass leading the way. And so it was stressful and scary, but we did make it through.
Yeah.
How did you stand the kayaks on you?
How do we stand the kayaks on end? Well, so our friend Brian Hansel, he paddled with us for a few days at the end, and he's a photographer, and it was his idea. And I think the 3 of us, just one of us sort of held the nose, and then the other 2 sort of stood it up. I can't remember if we had anyone else, like Amy's parents were there, so maybe they helped a little. No, they didn't help, I guess. But yeah, it made for a good picture. Yeah, I don't remember that being hard. I think it was just hard once they were standing straight up. They just sort of just had to hold on. Yeah, yeah.
It probably would have been bad if it was me, but fortunately it worked.
Miles.
Well, one of my favorites, we had these really nice, we actually still use them, these down sleeping mats, like these X-Bed sleeping mats that are filled with down. You sort of pump them up, and they're super comfortable and very warm. So yeah, that's one of my favorites. Yeah. Yeah, so how far out did we plan the logistics? So basically we were doing one stage, like, you know, paddling from up the inside passage. And while we were doing that, we were sort of like planning the next one. And then, so we were always sort of planning the next one, the next stage while we were doing the one before it. And yeah, it all worked out. And as far as resupplies, like we never wanted to have supplies like flown in a plane, or, you know, like, so all of the resupply points, we always did it in communities where we could, you know, go in to a store and buy the supplies, or we could get our supplies there relatively inexpensively, just because we didn't have a lot of money.
I want to prove to Lacey I can ask. So back when you were lining the canoes, there was you know, somebody was at the bow, but there was also a rope. I think the photographer was holding the rope back. How were you able to keep the canoe off the rocks on the bank? Was the current strong enough at the bank that it would keep the canoe out in the water?
Yeah, so how do we line the canoe? So basically, in that photo, it wasn't quite as we normally would be. Generally, the person at the back is holding the back line, and you pull on that line, and if the canoe turns a little bit sideways to the current, it forces the canoe out away from shore. If you pull the bow in, it would bring the canoe back in. So like light pressure on the back rope would keep the canoe from, you know, smashing into shore. Yeah. Let's see, what influenced us to pursue this lifestyle in our background? Go ahead.
Oh. Well, I think for both of us, it really has been being inspired by northern Minnesota and trips in the Boundary Waters as kids. You know, like we didn't know each other when we were young, and we just like fell in love with wild places and just kind of were pursuing more and more. And fortunately, at some point, we met each other in Grand Marais. Education wise, so Dave was a biology and anthropology major, and for me, actually, I was studying art therapy, like went to grad school for art therapy. So I kind of like diverged a little bit from that academic career path. But anything to add?
Well, I would just add that that I started the wilderness classroom with a man named Eric Frost. And he, at the time, he was a classroom teacher. So he sort of, in the beginning, the first like 10 years, he really added a lot of the sort of educational component and helped develop that aspect of it. Yeah.
When you, Great Slave Lake, did you meet up with Ely, Dave Olson, and his wife up there?
Yeah, did we meet Dave Olson? No, unfortunately we didn't, because his homestead was a lot further to the east. So the only time I ever ran into Dave Olson was on one of the first winter trips that Eric Frost and I did. It was dark, and we were at the Moose Lake Landing, and we had the headlights on because we were like setting our tent up in the parking lot because we got there really late. And we were gonna like leave in the morning. And it was super cold, and so having the headlights on had caused our battery to die. And I don't know, he was like visiting somebody or something, and so he stopped and jumped our battery for us. But we did, when we dog sledded through Delaney, I remember we were talking with someone who actually, I think originally was from Duluth, and he remembered Steger passing through Delaney like in like, I don't know, like in 1980 or the late 70s or something like that, on one of his ramblings around the north. So yeah. All right, well, I think we're sort of out of time, but thanks for joining us today. Thanks for all the great questions. We're going to be selling books outside, so if anyone wants a copy of the book, we'd be happy to sign it for you. Have a great day.